recording this and putting it up on our YouTube channel for anybody who wants to review it, or for some of the other members of the club who couldn't make it. So anyway, the topic is reason, rationalization, and expertise. And I'm eventually going to tie these together and show why they're related to each other. But we'll start out by dealing with them separately. And right, okay. So, let's start with like what is the definition? I think most people have a vague idea what reasoning is, and but rationalization is a slightly more fuzzy word, exactly what it is. Some philosophers, famously Nietzsche, for example, said that all philosophers, except him, of course, are basically rationalizing all the time. They're giving reasons why they believe this or say this, or why we should do this or that. But that raises a question, because in normal usage, when people use the word rationalization, they mean it in a usually critical way, like they're saying that person's just rationalizing, meaning they're doing something wrong, something that is either deceptive or incorrect, or they shouldn't be doing that. And the question is, well, what exactly is it, and how is it different from reasoning, or whatever? Does it have an opposite? The opposite of rationalization, I would guess, would be something like good reasoning. Okay, then what is good reasoning, and what is rationalization, and how do you tell the difference? In the sense that is of interest here, I'm going to give a definition of rationalization as basically good reasoning that is valid in the logical sense, in the sense that its premises are true. The reasoning from the premises to the conclusion is valid. It doesn't violate any logical laws or anything, but it still seems suspect or wrong. And in an extreme case of this, like in that cartoon about the donut, that's a classic example of an extreme case. Strictly speaking, the guy who's saying that the healthiest part of the donut is the whole, and the reason he has to eat the rest of the donut to get to the whole, that is logically correct. The argument, the premise there is, assuming you really care about health, he's saying he does because he wants to get to the healthiest part of the donut, and assuming that, and it is true that donuts do have holes. It's actually part of the definition of a donut, by the way, that it has a hole. If it doesn't have a hole, then it's not a donut. It could be some other kind of pastry, like a Boston cream or something with stuff in the middle. And compared to those other pastries, a donut the hole in the donut really is healthier than not having a hole in the center, because that's what you get with, say, a Boston cream or a jelly roll or something. So he's right. The hole is healthy compared to the rest of the donut, and it is the healthiest part of the donut. And there's a little sign in the background that says that, healthy eating tips, implying that he's taking those tips seriously. So his argument is, therefore, that's what I have to do. I have to eat this donut. Why is it a joke? Because although there's something wrong with the argument, we find most people obviously find that this motivation doesn't ring true to anyone who really eats a donut because they're concerned about health. Is hard to believe. It's hard to believe that's their real reason. And so that's what makes it a rationalization. Not that it's fallacious, bad reasoning, but it doesn't seem to apply in the particular case in which the person is trying to apply that reasoning. And so how do you know it doesn't apply? Is it impossible that somebody might actually be genuinely not joking? They really are interested in health, and they have a donut in front of them. They want to eat that donut versus, say, a jelly roll, because the donut is healthier than the jelly roll because it has a hole in it. That's not impossible that there could be a situation like that, but it just doesn't strike us as being likely the actual motivation of the person speaking. So that's what a rationalization is. It's when a bit of reasoning that, while not fallacious, doesn't strike us as being legitimately the reasoning that's actually motivating that person, the person who's using the rationalization, that something else is motivating. In this case, it's obvious that what that something else is. He wants to eat the donut. And the joke is he's looking for a rational excuse to justify the eating of the donut. Okay, so when it's pretty blatant like that, it's pretty easy to spot. But there are many other kinds of rationalization where that's not so easy. Or in fact, what might be a rationalization for one person wouldn't necessarily be one for someone else. And so what more needs to be said about rationalization before it becomes clear why so you can say, you can recognize an instance of it and then say, well, it's bad reasoning as opposed to good reasoning. So, but strictly speaking, good reasoning is just reasoning where the premises are true and the moves from the logical inferences from those premises to that conclusion doesn't violate any basic rules of reasoning or logic. But rationalization meets that criteria. So there must be something else going on, and what is that else? For one thing, rationalizations, first of all, why are they even important? In the case like the cartoon, it's obviously a joke. It's not that important what his reasons are, and that's why it's funny, because he's making a ceremony out of something which most people wouldn't bother to try to rationalize. But the thing is that the reason it becomes a problem, and a problem within ethics, is because rationalizations, are often used in more serious situations where people often give arguments for why they're doing something that, while not really incorrect, are perhaps inappropriate. I say perhaps because if they are aware of what they're doing and they know that what they're doing, they're actually could be making a case for saying, well, you think this is inappropriate, but I don't think so. So I'll use an example, a real example from a recent article by a couple of philosophers who are, what do they call them, like experimental XPhi or experimental philosophers. These are social and psychological oriented philosophers who use a lot of the tools of the social sciences like sociology or psychology to explore philosophical ideas, like mostly out of ethics. So they were interested in finding out, for example, what is the relationship are people who have a special expertise, who know a lot about a particular subject, are they more or less likely to rationalize their way whatever they do than, say, a person who doesn't have that expertise? So, for example, they noticed, they did an interesting study, and they found out by looking at the library records that in a philosophy library book or a library, the kind of book that's most likely to go missing or presumably stolen is an ethics book, which strikes some people as a little bit weird. Why wouldn't it be, say, a philosophy of mathematics or a philosophy of science or epistemology, but it's ethics? Why would that be the case? And they wrote a couple of articles about this, and you can find the whole articles, links to them in the write-up if you want. But basically, let me read a paragraph from it because it's their words and it's not me talking. It's just extremely interesting. If a professional ethicist, somebody who specializes in ethics, it's a major branch of philosophy, wants to steal a library book, for example, she can no doubt discover at least superficially plausible justification in terms of half a dozen different ethical theories, and she might be especially interested in doing so, compared to more informal philosophical and moral reasoning, extended professional philosophical discussion plausibly offers at least as many loci for bias to enter: plausibility, judgment, subsidiary motives. This is all getting technical. What he's trying to say here is that if you know all the ins and outs of how ethicists go around justifying this or that recommendation or conclusion, then they can easily find a theory, a major important theory, that would justify their doing this. For example, suppose the book is a very expensive, rare book that they know hardly anybody ever reads because it's only other academics who in that very small field would ever read it. So they don't feel they're harming very many people by so-called borrowing the book and keeping it for a while, maybe for good, because they feel, well, I am going to do something constructive and useful, and I can benefit from this book. I doubt very many other people could make much use of it, make much sense of it. Therefore, in a sense, from a utilitarian perspective, they could justify this and say, well, this behavior is okay in my particular case because more good will come of it than if I don't use this book. I intend to use this book constructively, and if it just sits on the shelf collecting dust, nobody reading it, it's doing nobody any good. So therefore, it's okay for me to take the book. That kind of reasoning, it's actually perfectly logical, utilitarian, ethical type defense. And it's that kind of reasoning that is a kind of rationalization. It's not incorrect reasoning. It might be true that the world would be a better place if they stole this book because they would make better use of it than anybody else would be. So they're not necessarily wrong. But it is, if you generalize this kind of thinking to justify any kind of ethical behavior, then you can imagine what you could, if you're very good at this sort of thing, at justifying your behavior, you're going to be able to come up with very plausible arguments that would justify you in behaving this way, and you might even use it to defend yourself should someone accuse you of having done something wrong. And their very expertise in this field gives them special credibility to do this. It's like a lawyer getting away with something that an ordinary person couldn't get away with because the lawyer knows the ins and outs of the law. Or, you can pick any other field. Being an expert in a particular field gives you inside information and a high level of understanding of how things work in that field that might plausibly give you a good argument for doing something that a person who isn't an expert in the field wouldn't be able to do as well. That is, justify their behavior. So that's an example of tying together rationalization with expertise. People with expertise are in a better position to rationalize, at least within their field, than a person who's not outside that field. And the irony, of course, is that this was an ethics book, and you think most people's ordinary ideas of ethics is that, people who study ethics, you wouldn't think would more likely go around stealing stuff than people who don't study ethics, right? But that's what they discovered. Apparently, this is more common, by the way, among people who are specialists in ethics than it is among those who study other branches of philosophy that have nothing to do with ethics, or even other academic disciplines that have nothing to do with philosophy. The study, it's not an overwhelming difference, but it's noticeable in their data that they collected about this, that people with expertise in a particular field, especially ethics, are more likely to justify their stealing than people without expertise in that field. And there's a good reason, although there haven't been a lot of experiments to show this, but there's good reason to think that that's not that uncommon in any other field, if the rationalization is about something that expert knows something about. So this is interesting, but it's not really very deep, or very doesn't apply to any really wide, some deep fundamental philosophical question. At least not yet. But I'm going to try to talk about some cases that do have interesting implications for very big questions in philosophy that arise from this concern about rationalization. But before I'm going to pause here. And does anybody have any thoughts or reactions to what I've said so far? Any, questions or comments?
Sure, I'll hop in.
Right.
I've got somewhere on my computer a link to an article about economists and the way that they rationalize economic policy advice in terms of it being welfare maximizing, enlarging the size of GDP, and therefore, in some sense, making all people better off, assuming the compensation principle is in operation, which is that the winners compensate the losers from this policy change. Then everyone's better off. And this article talks about the way conservative economists who are much more pro-market and anti-regulation justify their policy guidance in this way. But the article is about how the conservative economists actually let themselves be used by interest groups who actually prefer policies that don't increase the whole GDP, that don't make everyone better off, even hypothetically with the compensation principle. So this is a case of these kinds of economists rationalizing their policy guidance based on some kind of welfare maximization prediction that if the policy is implemented, it will maximize welfare in this sense that I've defined, when actually it won't. So, yeah, I'll see if I can find that article.
What do you think is going on there? I mean, why are they doing that? What's in it? What are they trying to accomplish? I mean,
I'm not an expert on this, but my guess is that those economists benefit in their own lives. Well, I think it's maybe one reason is that they benefit in their own lives in some way, either through increased social connections or increased income. Another is that they're actually bought in, is that the economists, bought in is not the right word. What I meant to say was, bought into to that analytical framework that assumes that if you're deregulating a market or reducing the amount of regulation, it's automatically welfare maximizing. They're kind of bought into their modeling framework, where if you can build a model that a move towards less regulation is welfare improving, then that means it must be happening that way in the real world. And they just, they're leaving out variables that operate in the real world. But they're just bought into their, I think that's another way it can happen.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thanks, Bill.
I have a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
The word that keeps coming up in my mind is motivations. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to divorce that from rationalizing.
Yeah, we're going to get to focus on motivations here in a moment, because did you want to say more about it, or you just wanted to bring that up?
No, it's just it seems like motivations saturate all kinds of reasoning, period.
Right.
So you can always, that's where you want to look. Why someone made some kind of judgment.
Right. Well, in fact, that's where we're going to be going in a moment, because that's one of the, this is where it gets pretty deep. Well, I'm going to be exploring one of the implications that follows from one of the most influential ethical theories in Western philosophy, that of Immanuel Kant, who a lot of people have certainly heard of him, and maybe not many people have read his stuff, but there is. I did graduate work on him a long time ago, back as a student, and I focused on something that's relevant here, and it's related to most people. I'll just give a brief overview of his moral theory, and one little aspect of it, which is often gets overlooked, but it's it's very critical because of what its implications are, and it has everything in the world to do with motivation. And first of all, let me just a brief, overview of Kant and what his moral theory was and how it contrasts with alternatives, or at least other famous ones. Kant is famous for, most people maybe have heard of the categorical imperative, and I'm not going to go into all there's a vast amount of literature on it, but the basic idea of it all is this. What Kant thinks should motivate moral behavior is that when you do something, it should be that has moral implications. It should be something that's done out of respect for the rational autonomy of whoever it is you're interacting with, a person or other people. What is rational autonomy? What Kant thinks is so important about ethical agents, and an ethical agent is somebody who he thought is in a position to govern their own behavior by their own reasoning, he called it self-legislation. You say, I have these principles, they're going to guide my behavior. No one's pulling my strings. I know what I'm doing, adopted these principles, are going to shape my behavior. And those principles are, in Kant's view, should be related to having the utmost respect for all rational beings. Because, so for example, to give a hardcore example, what's wrong with lying? Kant had a completely exceptionless rule about lying. He said, under no circumstances should one ever lie to anyone, okay? Now, this is highly contested by many other people, because many people can think of a lot of situations in which lying may be the most morally appropriate thing to do. And even Kant challenged himself with his famous axe murder at the door. Suppose somebody knocks on your door and they start looking for some innocent person they want to go kill with an axe, okay? And you happen to know where this person is at. And they're asking you for the whereabouts of this person. And let's say, to keep the case clean, that you yourself are not in any danger, but this innocent party is, and you know where they're at. Should you tell this murderer where they're at? Kant says no, you shouldn't tell. I'm sorry. Kant says yes, because if you know where they're at and you lie to this murderer, you are lying, and that's wrong. And a utilitarian looks at that and says, that's crazy. I mean, the consequences of lying in that case are far better than the consequences of telling the truth. And they're going to judge everything by consequences. Consequentialists and utilitarians are those who believe that what comes after an act is what determines whether it's good or bad, not what your intentions or what's going on in your head, but the consequences. So they would say lying is perfectly okay if you can justify it because the consequences are the best possible ones it could obtain. And so they would disagree with Kant, and they would say, of course, you would want the right thing to do in that situation is to lie. But Kant insists that it would be wrong to lie. And what would he say if someone, how would he explain that? And his answer is simply this, that to lie to anyone, even an axe murderer, unless you were very sure this guy was insane. Now that would get you out of this loop. But if he, because essentially it is their act that is wrong, and they have responsibility for their own acts, you can control whether or not you tell the truth or not, and only that is within your control. What the axe murderer does is not in your control. In fact, you can't control the world, what's going to happen outside in the world. You can only control what your internal motivation is. So your motivation ought to be always and everywhere to tell the truth to anyone who asks, if you know it, and at least if you're addressing another rational agent. In the case of telling the truth to a non-rational agent, then all bets are off, because like a small child, for example, or someone who's insane, or something like that, if they're not capable of making decisions for themselves, and you know this, then this rule doesn't apply. But in any other case, it is incorrect or immoral to lie, even if you can see that the consequences are going to be pretty bad. And his answer is that, well, yes, the consequences will be bad, but it's not your fault. It's this axe murderer who's going to be doing the crime, not you. But a utilitarian or a consequentialist just looks at that and just rolls their eyes because they just don't see how the internal motive that you could have could possibly be so special that it overrides the horrible consequences of this. Consequences for them always override whatever motives or intentions you have. That's an opposing theory of ethics. But this is where an example where the two theories clash. They say opposite things. And there are lots of other examples that bring home the point. That was a made-up case, but there's actually a real case that was had a lot of ethicists scratching their heads. It came up a few decades ago before. Now there's a law that straightens it out, but at that time there wasn't. And this involved a mother who's had a car accident with her 8-year-old daughter. It was a very serious accident. The daughter was killed instantly in the accident. The mother wakes up very seriously hurt in the hospital, doesn't know yet what happened to her daughter. Her first question is, what happened to the daughter? The medical professionals know what happened. She's dead. But they also knew that the mother needed to have a very serious operation, and she needed every ounce of will to live that she could muster to make it through herself. And at the time, the medical staff there made a strategic decision that let's not tell her the truth right now. Let's go through with the operation, and she'll find out soon enough after she recovers. And so they lied to her. And they went through with the operation, and she did recover. And afterwards, she sued the medical staff for and she won. And as far as I know, the law now is that you cannot, the medical profession staff cannot lie to you about something, no matter what it is, even if they believe that it's not in your best interest for you to know the truth, because you might suffer for it. A consequentialist would disagree with that. They'd say, no, lying is good if it saves lives and prevents, this is an example of how Kant's thinking is still very, very much alive, and people do take, say, a mother's right to know what became of her child to be so sacred and so important that if she asks, it is wrong for you to lie to her, even if you know the consequences would be bad for her and for everyone, for anybody, well, especially for her. And the law finally, as far as I recall, did change to make that official. At the time this incident happened, it wasn't clear what the right thing to do was, but now it is. Now, if you're a medical staff in that situation, you have to answer questions truthfully. Doesn't matter what consequences will come of it. Now, if they're not conscious, is another matter. Had she not woken up in the hospital, then they're perfectly within their rights to do whatever it takes to save her life. It's only they can't lie to a conscious patient about what's something if they know otherwise, of course. So anyway, I'm not going to get deep into Kant's philosophy, but the important part is this. For Kant, what makes an act moral is what comes before the act is done. It's in the intent, the motive, the maxim, what's going on in the mind of the moral agent before they act. Why are they doing this? If their motive is a good one, a morally acceptable one, that could justify their actions, even if the consequences are bad. That's from his perspective. And it does, and the reason Kant says that is because he doesn't think we have control over consequences. A lot of things could happen in the world that we don't control, but he does think we have control over our inner motives. Even if we have no control over the rest of the world, we at least know what our motives are, and we could take responsibility and take charge of those motives, even if we can't do anything about what happens in the real world. You can't hold people responsible for consequences to the extent he thinks, as you can hold people responsible for what their motives are. So that's in a nutshell what the big difference is, say, between a Kantian or deontological moral theory and the major competitor, the consequentialists or the utilitarians, who think that internal states are neither here nor there as far as what's moral. They judge everything by what happens, what the consequences are. Now, there are problems for their theory as well, but we're not going to get into that right now. But the relevant part of this is, okay, supposing that you are sympathetic to Kant's view, or to something vaguely like Kant's view, that you do think that what's going on inside the mind of the person who's using, who's trying to justify their behavior, whether it's a belief, an action, or something they say, has a lot to do with what's their motive, what's going on here that determines whether it's a good act or a moral act or not. So for Kant, as I said earlier, for him, the only thing you could be held responsible for is something that you are in control of. If you're not in control of it, then some external forces are acting on you, and you can't be held responsible for that because they are forces that you have no control over. So what are those? And it turns out that and Kant was aware of this because he went through a whole bunch of objections which people brought up to his view, because obviously it does provoke a lot of people. And there what are the competing? He said the only motive that makes an act moral is that which is done out of respect for rational autonomy, respect for the other person, because they're a rationally capable being. You must treat them like they are, to use the word he used, like a little god, someone you don't go around playing around with, or and you have to be treated the same way because you're a rationally autonomous being too. There's this kingdom of ends, he called it, where in a way, in an ideal moral world, everybody would treat everybody else as though they were like a little god on the same level as themselves, because we're the only creatures in the universe that can govern our own behavior through reason at the time. Although he was open to the possibility that there are aliens on other planets who can do the same, then we have moral obligations to them as well. And maybe even artificial intelligences, if they ever convincingly or seem to be able to take responsibility for their decisions and govern themselves, then it would apply to them as well. But in Kant's time, he only knew of human beings and no other animal on the planet who could do this. So that's who he was talking about. Okay, so, but how often does it happen that people do things that have moral import, and all they're thinking about is the respect for rational autonomy? And a lot of critics said that doesn't reflect reality. The fact is, the vast majority of human actions are not motivated, not at the time anyway, by any high-flown concept of this. Think about this. What he's talking about, respect is a feeling. He admitted it's a feeling, but it's a feeling inspired by an abstract principle. This principle that that rational autonomy is the most wonderful thing in the universe, and that and you're supposed to be in awe of that idea, and in awe that you are one of those self-legislating agents, as well as other people and anybody who's rational. And that should be the only pure motive that governs your action. However, how often does that happen? Well, when you go down the list of things, he went down a list of things that are commonly motivating human behavior. And when you add up this list and subtract it from all human acts, it threatens to take away every single act that has anybody's ever claimed to be moral in history. For example, let's start with one of the most common ones. A lot of human behavior's control is through habit, through training. Aristotle's theory was in fact based upon this. He said that a good person, a good act is an act that's done by a good person. And who is a good person, according to Aristotle? Someone who has been trained with a certain set of virtues. Like a well-trained dog, they do what they're expected to do. And who trains them? Well, they grow up in a community in which there are role models. These people who are everybody looks up to as being the ideals of what a good person should be like. So your job is to learn to be like them, to train yourself to be like them. It could start out with your own parents. I mean, those are the first people that you encounter. You imitate them. You imitate virtuous people. In the beginning, he admits this is hard. So we're unruly, we're undisciplined, but eventually he thinks that if all goes well, we'll become at least to a great extent, acquire virtue by having imitated to some degree the ideals that a given society has for what a good person is. So there isn't a strict rule about what's good or bad. There's just, here's a person that everybody around you in your community looks up to. Well, you should model your behavior on that. What they do is what you should do. And eventually the goal is for this to become second nature, where you no longer have to fight with yourself to do the right thing. It just comes naturally. If you ever get to that point, and Aristotle thought that after a lifetime of struggling with your passions and all your things that would push and pull you this way and that, you accomplish it, then you become a truly virtuous person, according to Aristotle. Well, Kant dismissed all of that. Why? Because virtue or habit is a habit, is like if you're an automatic pilot. You're doing the right thing because it's what you do, like a knee-jerk reaction. Is that a good act? In Kant's view, no. It's not an evil act. It might be it might be external. It may be in conformity with what a good person would do. It might be indistinguishable from what a good person would do from the outside, but it wouldn't be a moral act because it wasn't motivated by the proper motivation. It was like a shortcut. You've been programmed, so to speak, to behave this way. And whenever you're acting because you're out of, from a sense of like habit or training, you may be doing good, but your act isn't moral, but you're not getting any moral credit for it. Okay, because your motivation wasn't the correct one. You were like a well-trained dog. Maybe the trainers of the dog are the ones who should get the credit, but not the dog, if the dog behaves itself. So all behavior that's done out of habit is not immoral, but it's amoral, or what he called adiaphorous, which means that it's neither here nor there. It's neutral as far as the morality of the act is. That's one thing. There's another one, and these next two are consequentialist. One is fear. Doing something out of fear because of the consequences, that's not moral either. That's like obeying the law because you'll get a fine, or if you don't do it. And if that's the only reason you're doing it, because you're going to get punished if you don't, that's not a proper moral motivation. It might get you to behave legally, but legality and morality are two separate things from Kant's point of view. Legality is about behavior that anybody can observe. You're behaving in conformity with what the so-called law says you ought to do. If you're doing that, the law isn't concerned about your motives. If you're caught, speeding, well, the law isn't supposed to be concerned about your motives. In practice, there might be situations where they might bend the law for you, like if you were speeding because of an emergency and you went to court to fight the ticket because your loved one was in the hospital, was about to die or something, or you were taking someone who needed to get to the hospital in a hurry. They might make an exception, but their law, that's not written into any law that there are exceptions. And so they don't really care why you're obeying the speed limit, just that you obey it. But from Kant's point of view, that's a behavior is stuff that what's wrong with that from a moral point of view, it's not wrong, it's just not moral, is that fear can never be a moral motivation. If that's why you're doing something, you're doing it to avoid pain and suffering for yourself, it's basically selfish. You're looking out for your own good. You don't want to experience the painful consequences of breaking the law, therefore you obey the law. Well, fine, that gets behavior, but it gets you to behave correctly as far as the law is concerned, but it doesn't add anything to the morality of your behavior from Kant's perspective, because the motivation isn't the right one. The right one should be because you're aware that the reason this law exists is because it helps protect the well-being of rationally autonomous people, and they're precious in the universe. That's the ultimate moral motivation for why you should do anything, is that, not because you're afraid of you're going to get fined or something. And similarly, self-interest. A lot of human behavior is just plain and looking out for number one. He doesn't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that. It's just there's nothing right about it. It's animal behavior. Just like animals cannot be judged morally, when we act like animals, we can't be judged morally either. Not immoral. We're not immoral either. But we are. The act when we do something that is instinctive or driven by interests that we share with the animal world, eating, drinking, reproducing. Those things aren't moral acts in the sense that they're not immoral, but they're not moral, they're morally neutral. They could become immoral or moral in very special circumstances, provided that somehow we're tied to this respect for rational autonomy, but they are neither here nor there as far as morality is concerned. So looking out for yourself, self-interest is also ruled out as a moral act. And this one is, and then finally, the last one, which is a little bit, many people would argue with, and that's sympathy or empathy. An act that's done because you feel sorry for someone, out of you help somebody out because their pain affects you, and so you don't, and you're able to help them. That too is not a moral act, and not an immoral one, but not a moral one in Kant's view either. Not to the why? Because it's dependent upon you having these feelings of empathy and benevolence, which are not in your control. You either have them or you don't. A psychopath, for example, can't be blamed on moral Kantian grounds for not having any fellow feeling for the pain and suffering of others, because they didn't make themselves that way. If they had designed themselves to be psychopaths, then you could hold them responsible, but it's not their fault. And if they have to, a psychopath would somehow have to compensate for their lack of feeling for others by being extremely strict on themselves to always follow what a moral person would do. Even if they don't have the correct motive for doing it, at least they're trying to imitate a good person, even if they aren't really a good person. So when you put all these together, you rule out all human actions that are habitual, that are motivated by fear, by self-interest, by empathy or concern for other people. What's left? I mean, how many human actions remain that you could say, what's an example of something that really is a purely moral act in which none of these things figure in? Well, Kant would say it would have to be something that he thinks of the clearest example of a truly moral act where it's not that these things can't be moral, is that it's hard to see if they're moral because of these other forces acting on you, but you're contaminating your motive. The contamination of your motive by these other things, which I listed, habit, fear, self-interest, empathy, is what rules out their pure morality. To be uncontaminated, your motive would have to be something that it's not habitual to you. You're not doing it out of fear, and there's nothing in it for you. It's not self-interest, and you're not being motivated because you're feeling sorry for someone or anything. Now, what kind of act would that be? It would always have to be something that you are inclined not to do, don't want to do, have to force yourself, almost like a sense of duty to do it. In fact, he did say that a person who is a psychopath, for example, because someone who is not inclined to naturally do good things for people, but who does them anyway, does them anyway, might be an example of a pure Kantian. That would be an example if such psychopaths ever did behave this way against their own inclination, against their own self-interest. That would be a pure act of morality. A pure moral act, according to Kant. And how often does that happen? Even Kant said, maybe never. And this is where he says some really strange things that he says, maybe in the whole history of the human race, not a single moral act has ever happened, because all these other motivations are almost always crowding in and pulling our strings. This abstract one that Kant's concerned with is so rarefied, so pure, that it's hard to imagine a human being behaving that way, purely out of respect for a rational, an abstract principle. Now, this idea kind of understandably makes a lot of people think that Kant is crazy, that his theory is not relevant to human beings as we find them in the world, And he would almost agree with that. He said, yeah, as we find them in the world, that this doesn't apply to them. But it's what they ought to be like, he's saying. It's not, morality is not about describing what is, it's about describing what ought to be. It's the ought, the should here. In a way, Kant has set the standard for what is moral so sky high that no one will ever reach it. And that was, the assumption is, that's the plan, to keep you on your toes at all times so that you don't get complacent about why you do things. You're always self-questioning. You're always asking yourself, well, am I doing this for the right reason or not? And he's left, okay. And that's okay, now, there's another part of his theory, and this he shares with other philosophers who otherwise may not agree with him. But if you combine this other thing with what I've been talking about, you get this full-fledged attack on what we call transparency. Transparency, self-transparency about one's own motive. Like, can you ever know what your own motive is in doing something? And everything that Kant says suggests, no, you can't. You'll always be. In fact, you're the last person that, here's the paradox. On the one hand, you're the last person in the world to ask about your own motives. Why? Because you're self-interested. It's yourself. How can you not be interested in your own motives? And that disqualifies you from being objective about your own motives. But the other side of it is no one else is qualified either, because they can't be inside your head. They don't know what's really going there because they're not you. So if you rule out other people because they can't know what's really going on inside you, and if you rule out yourself because you have a special interest in what's going on inside yourself, who is left to make a judgment about what your true motives are? And the implication is nobody is. So our motives, our deepest motives, ultimate motives from Kant's perspective, are opaque. In other words, we can never really know for sure what our motives are. We can suspect that this or that is involved. In all probability, all those things I listed are involved in many of the things we do: habit, fear, self-interest, concern for other people. All that, in some degree or other, is probably mixed into a lot of our behavior when we interact with people. But no, they're all morally neutral motives from Kant's perspective. And the only true one is one that seems inaccessible to us to know for sure, or it seems that way. So what Kant was a psychological egoist. That's a term that's used to describe anyone who thinks that our starting point about as far as human beings, it's built into us to look for our self-interest first. It doesn't mean we don't care about other people. It just means that we're going to look out for ourselves before we look out for other people. Or unless somehow we absorb other people into our concept of self, there is a way around it in that way, where you might indeed find yourself so attached to someone that you would die for them, in which case it isn't that you have gotten rid of your self-interest, it's that your self-interest now has like swallowed them up, so that an attack or harm to them is harm to you, and you don't make a distinction anymore. But it all starts, as in the animal world and with children, and probably with most adults. Perhaps there are some people who do rise to a level of absorbing the well-being of someone else to such an extent that they don't make a distinction anymore between themselves and that person. But because we're psychologically self-interested, it's going to make it so that we cannot be a judge of our own acts, because it would be like putting a murderer on the jury that's judging himself. He would obviously be wouldn't be impartial because he's judging himself. So we can't be on the jury that's judging our own motives because we have an interest in the outcome. But if you combine that with the fact that no one else can be on that jury either, because they don't know what's going on inside you, because they're other parties, they can infer, they can guess, they can say, well, given from their behavior, I'm guessing they must have this motive, but they can never know for sure. They're always on the outside. So you put all this together, and the bottom line is that there's something called reflexive moral knowledge, which is knowledge of regarding the true moral goodness or badness of your own acts or your own character. Only you know what motivated you to do something, and yet only you are disqualified from making that judgment because it's your self-interest. So the bottom line is that moral self-knowledge is opaque. It's not transparent. We will never have it. We are forever locked out of it, of having genuine knowledge of our own moral acts. And other people are locked out too, because they can judge your behavior. They can judge the legality of your behavior, how well your behavior conforms or doesn't conform with whatever moral norms you want, but they don't know what's going on inside you, and it's because they're not you. And you who supposedly do know what's going on inside you are disqualified because you are not an objective party. You're going to find it's very natural for you to find ways to rationalize whatever you want as far as your motives go. And that's what happens with these ethicists rationalizing their behavior, or anybody rationalizing their behavior. To the extent that they and only they know what's going on inside them, they can get away with that in a way because no one else can say, well, that's not true. How would they know? And yet you don't know either. You don't know for a different reason than what reason the other people don't have. Other people don't know because they're not inside your head. You don't know because you are inside your head, but you're not an objective party. So the bottom line is, from Kant's point of view, there might not, in the whole history of the human race, ever been a single moral act. It would have to, or I should say, no, that's not true. There never can be a case where someone knows there is a moral act. It's knowledge of it that's forbidden, not the act itself. It could be that people have done moral things according to Kant, but they couldn't know it. They couldn't have access to that knowledge because you don't have transparency with regard to your own motives. Okay, before I go on to talk about some of the wider implications of this, I'll pause right now. And anybody want to roll their eyes or say something about what have been about Kant or this year? Or is it totally crazy, or does it make sense to you? Anybody here? Or if you don't agree with this view, there is another set of philosophers who are not psychological egoists, the moral sense theorists. They include, oddly enough, Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations. It includes David Hume, famously, and who else? Oh, and interestingly enough, someone who's usually not in the same strange bedfellow with Adam Smith, and that's Karl Marx. All these people, the ones, and they're probably, I think Rousseau also would be included in there. All these people genuinely believed, it was a basic principle of their moral theories, that human beings are basically good, and that it's only circumstances that cause us to behave badly or do bad things. In other words, it's the world around us that makes us do bad things. If only we want to improve ourselves, we need to improve the world around us. And that's how we do good. So they start out giving people credit for being basically good, and if they do bad things, it's because their environment promoted it somehow. Kant reverses that, says, well, we can't go around assuming that people are basically good. We can't go around assuming that they're basically anything. In fact, we have lots of good reasons to believe that they are going to be looking out. They're going to be selfish. Why? There are good evolutionary reasons for that. Think of animals that were always sacrificing themselves for other animals. Those animals died out a long time ago. The ones that are here now are the ones who did look out for themselves. So it stands to reason that their genes survived. And that's why we are here, because we are the descendants of those very selfish people in the past who wiped out the people who weren't very selfish. And of course, there's another, you could also say that altruism or concern for other people is also a useful evolutionary trait, because by caring for other people, you make your chances of your own survival better, because they might return the favor. So that, I mean, there's an evolutionary role for altruism as well. But by and large, the difference here is between those who think that psychological egoism is more basic and those who think that, no, we're basically good and it's our environment that makes us do bad things sometimes. Anyway, any comments on any of this or questions?
I'll say something, I guess.
Yeah.
I think modern AI is most like Aristotle, what you described as Aristotle's theory of ethics, in which you just copy the crowd, because modern AI is trained. It learns by ingesting a massive amount of the crowd. I mean, basically just information on the internet. So if in a car crash you're supposed to behave in a certain way, that's what's moral to do. That it may read in a bunch of examples to that effect, and then that's the answer. But there isn't any intrinsic. The AI doesn't have an intrinsic rationality, really, like in the Kantian sense of being an agent that is like a god, certainly not like a god, and has a knowledge of an intention of what it's doing. It's just repeating what the crowd did, basically. Although I hasten to add, modern AI is also there's a supervision step with a person usually that looks over the answers, and a reward scheme too. So it's not all just inputting random information on the internet, or at least it shouldn't be. But Victor, I didn't realize Kant was so eliminative. It sounds like, I mean, if you eliminate every possible motive, I mean, what in the it's no wonder Nietzsche didn't like him very much. I mean, what he's proposed sounds absurd. I mean, to me, it kind of lacks first principles. So, I mean,
what?
Doesn't it kind of lack first principles? I mean, he's saying you always want to do what would be good for the other person. So, yeah, you have to be aware of that motive, right?
Well, okay, he does have a first principle, and it's kind of an abstract. He says, okay, the way he looks at the world is that he thinks the most unique, special thing in the universe that we know of, the thing that inspires great awe, is that we are, is something called rational autonomy, that a thing, a creature, an entity, a being can decide for itself what it's going to do, as opposed to being constantly having its strings pulled by natural forces or the laws of physics or the laws of nature. He thinks we human beings are the only instance he knows of beings who can go against what their natural inclinations are. So if they're inclined to, for example, to lash out at someone who offends them, that's a natural impulse to be defensive. Well, he thinks that you can control it. It's possible. He doesn't say it happens very often, but he thinks we can take the reins of our own behavior and thought and take responsibility for itself and not blame it on nature, on evolution, on our upbringing, on people around us. We can somehow break out of the determinism of the world that surrounds us, which is always governed by stuff that happens in the past. He was a kind of, he defended free will in it, but he was also a determinist. He's one of those people who's both, because he was a dualist, but that's another story. But he did think the natural world, everything around us, including other people, to the extent other people are really animals, they're having their strings pulled by a host of those things that evolved for obvious reasons, because they were conducive to our being here. Things like training and habit, that it's useful to be able to learn things from the people around you. It's important to be concerned about things that might harm you, be concerned about fear of consequences. It's important to look out for your own well-being, self-interest, selfishness, and sometimes it's helpful to be concerned about the well-being of those people around you. That this is where empathy has utility, because it might help you too. It's a good idea to get along with people and to be nice to them, because it might help you. So, but there's a kind of self-interest there too. It's not, well, there's such a thing as a lot of altruism might be interpreted as an expanded form of self-interest, but there is a way of conceptualizing altruism to be, it's not so much that I'm helping other people because I want something back from them. I might want to help other people because I've actually become, I've absorbed, my conception of who I am now includes them. I've like expanded who yourself is to include them. But all those things I've talked about are things that have their source in nature, and nothing about nature has anything to do with morality from Kant's perspective. Nature just is what it is. It does what it does. There's no good or bad or evil or wrong in nature. There is that which conduces to survival, but hey, why is survival such a good thing? I mean, nature has not shown itself. I mean, millions of species that didn't survive. Nature had no pity on them. Why would you think that it's going to have pity on us? So nature is completely, it's not evil. It's what that third category called amoral or adiaphorous. It's just is, doesn't have an ought in it involved with it. Just is the way it is. And human beings, because we're rationally capable, are now able to bring into the universe right and wrong, good and bad, because we place value on certain things and disvalue on other things. And that's will ultimately become the source of our morality. And he thinks what's so special and unique about human beings is that we're rationally autonomous. Any other feature about human beings, you can find some animal out there who can do it better than us. But this is one thing he thinks that we stand out, at least so far. And as far as he knows, we're the only beings in the universe capable of it. Well, I think in some places he does entertain the possibility there could be beings on other planets that are just as rationally autonomous as us. It's a possibility, but as far as he knows, we're it. And now, you said, well, this sounds kind of crazy, having the standard of morality be so sky high that nobody ever attains it. Well, I think the response would be something like this: that in a way, that's how it ought to be, because if you were to bring morality down to everyday humdrum real world, it would be contaminated with all these other motives. Which he admits are part of the natural world, but he thought we were unique in being part of two worlds: the natural world, the phenomenal world, and the other world, is the noumenal world. He was a dualist. He thought that the universe, there's everything around us that's part of the phenomenal world, which includes the world of trees, plants, animals, and then we also participated in this other world, which you call the noumenal world. It's the world of mind, thought, of reason, and nothing else in the universe could participate in that world, and that's what made us special, and why we should be the objects of such great respect, and why our ability to participate in that world is what deserved special consideration. So he saw us as. Anyway, his standard was deliberately sky high so that we would never confuse it with anything down here, the more humdrum motives. And it also put a kind of incentive for morality to keep progressing, to keep pushing ahead and saying, well, what's moral today might be seen as immoral next year or 100 years from now. Why? Because our consciousness will have expanded to include, to notice that certain things we find acceptable today aren't in the end acceptable, because we kept on pressing harder and harder on ourselves. He saw it as a never-ending forward march toward who knows what. But
it was the age of enlightenment, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was a time when people were very optimistic about human rational capability, and he was like at the top of that pinnacle of that period. And of course, Nietzsche was part of a reaction to it. Thought he was just had gone off the deep end, you know. But he wasn't alone. I mean, there were others. Obviously, the consequentialists, the utilitarians, all thought he was. Well, for one thing, they weren't dualists. They said there's just the natural world. That's all there is. And all these natural motives, you know, habit, fear, selfishness, empathy, all that stuff that's all there is. There isn't any other motive. All the things that human beings ever do have their origin in one or more of these things, and that's all there is. But Kant wanted to say, no, there's something else that's beyond that can pull on us. Okay. And well, okay, so it's easy to dismiss Kant and say he's way out there, he's off the deep end. But the thing is, some Kantian ideas are still very much alive in a lot of human institutions, like the law, for example. And we'll make, I'm going to get into some of those in a moment. But before I do that, did anybody else want to say anything else so far, or questions, doubts?
Yeah, I would like to say something, if that's okay. I mean, Kant put forward a ideal, but maybe that's not where the line should be drawn. Maybe it's just a spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one absolute, but in every day we make these judgments nevertheless, and these judgments are useful. So having a ideal, which Kant proposed, is great, but I think whether that help us to draw the line is another question, and I think that's what, in my opinion, what the philosophy is something that we should pursue, because that's very practical, and also some of the point that you mentioned about being motivated by fear and empathy and habit and all that, right? I think they might actually serve a different purpose in terms of drawing the line, because I think these might be the ground for people to judge an act as virtue. Because if you can able to overcome these, these sorts of internal motivation, that would be like a necessary condition, in my opinion, or maybe even sufficient condition for judging a virtue. So I think some of these points are actually useful in terms of helping us drawing the line. And just maybe one last point that I have to say is that I'm not sure that when we talk about moral, there's the part where it's virtuous, and this part that's duty, right? And I'm not sure how the Kantian view actually distinguish the two concepts. I mean, there's the one ideal, right? But is that the ideal for the virtue, or is that the ideal for the duty, which is like two different topics, if you know what I mean?
You mean like you mean like what was virtue from Kant's perspective? Is that what you're getting at, or?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we are unable to judge moral, but are we unable to judge what's virtuous, or are we unable to judge what is fulfilling a duty?
Okay, well, he says even in our own case, but of course in the case of other people, when we judge other people, we don't have anything to go on except what we observe, what I hear them say, what they do, what we know about in the past. From all that data, we infer some guess as to what was going on inside them. And first of all, well, why are we even concerned about what's going on inside them in the first place? Why not just deal with appearances? If they look like they're a murderer, they behave like the murderer, then they're a murderer. That's it. You make a policy of how to deal with murders. But you don't need to inquire what's going on, what was their motive or that stuff, unless you're trying to say you've made a distinction and said, well, certain kinds of people who kill people are innocent because they don't know any better, because they're mentally ill, because they're children, and so on. Then it is important to know, like, okay, what's going on inside them. But I think as a practical matter, Kant would say that in terms of judging other people, we have nothing else to go on but what we observe. And we can try to infer motives from that, but it is an inference. It's not, we don't have direct access to what's really going on inside them, and we could be wrong. But that part is not revolutionary. I think people have been saying that forever. What is more striking is that when he says that even the person themselves doesn't know their own motives, that's even on another level. Because now, if they don't know it can't know their really true, what really made them do what they did, and others can only infer it, then who does? And this might make some people want to dismiss the whole thing as like, well, this is a total useless bit of philosophy, because where are we going to go with this? I mean, why care about motives at all? If the person themselves doesn't know what they are, and outsiders can only guess, and their guesses are going to be based on behavior, and they can classify certain behaviors in whatever way they want, but I mean, that's the full extent of morality of what you can see from the outside. For Kant, that wasn't the case. As far as duty is concerned, from Kant's perspective, once you, assuming you do agree with him that their rational autonomy is an incredibly rare and godlike, holy-like, sacred thing, then from his point of perspective, if part of doing that is you automatically are in awe. This respect he's talking about is like an awe. It's like an aesthetic experience. It's almost like a vision. You see this, you realize that we're special because we can do this, and that generates duties and rights. Rights on the part of these rational autonomous beings to be treated certain ways, and duties on the parts of everybody else to respect those rights. And that is, so we have a duty to, for example, a duty not to lie to people. Even if we have every temptation to want to lie, like in the case of the axe murder, even when there's lots of natural, understandable forces that are pushing us to lie, we have a duty to avoid it, to struggle. A duty is supposed to be a little bit onerous, like a little bit difficult, to go against what all these other forces are trying to nudge us toward. And the fact that we can go against it is an example of our rational autonomy. A being who cannot go against these forces would be like an animal or a small child. They are completely being pulled in this way and that by the things around them, by natural forces. They're not in control of what they do. Human rational agents, in Kant's view, are, or not that they are, but they are capable of. He's perfectly willing to admit that the vast majority of even adults and practice are not really in control of themselves. Strings are being pulled all the time. But he does think they're capable. It's this capability that he's hanging his whole theory on, that we're capable of such a thing, which he thinks is fantastic. How often the capability gets used is probably perhaps never, but it's certainly, that's what makes his theory what it is.
I guess my main question is, it seems that, Kant claims that we cannot make a judgment on what's moral, but I'm saying that I'm not sure whether what he's meant by we cannot tell what's virtuous, or what we cannot tell is that is, someone failing meeting a duty. For example, let's say I left my child at home, right? So I'm guilty of that. So does it mean there's no moral judgment for my negligence? No one can judge me because of that? I'm not so sure. I think for the virtue part, in my opinion, I can kind of agree with what he says, because that's more motivation driven. But let's say if I neglect something, right? People should be able to judge whether I did this as a moral act or not, right? Let's say I left my child. Using that example. So I wonder, what's Kant's response for for that?
There's an important distinction. It's in the write-up too. It's about Kant made a distinction between legality and morality. Legality is, and it doesn't necessarily mean what governments pass, the laws they pass, although it includes that, but it's a larger category. You can judge the legality of an act by observation. Is it the kind of thing that a good person would do? Then, if it is, it's within the scope of legality. It's like
I'm not talking about the legal aspect. I'm just saying the fact that I neglect my child, for example.
Yeah, well, but you see, the moral law involves two things. It does involve behavior, but not enough. Behavior is not enough. The mental state of the person agent is critical to its morality. So you could say that legality is a necessary but insufficient condition for morality. So behaving, treating people well, not abusing them and so forth is like a necessary condition to be moral, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
Never is enough for him. There's always this internal thing that you need in addition to that.
Maybe it's just correlated, not even necessary. But yeah, I agree. I'm with you so far. Yeah.
It's a necessary but insufficient condition to appear to do the right thing. And that's what he was saying. He said there are, in theory, could people who do exactly the right thing in the eyes of the whole world all the time, and they could still be immoral from Kant's perspective. They will have met one of the criteria, the legal part, but because their motive wasn't right, that's what keeps it from being moral under his definition. And of course, a lot of competing moral theories disagree with this. The consequentialists, for example, utilitarians think all this stuff is worthless. But what's interesting about this is that Kant himself, this criticism that we're making morality such a sky high, the standards are so sky high that they're inaccessible to us, is something Kant was well aware of and accepted. He said that just means that we're forever going to be competitors in a race to be moral, but we'll never win. But that doesn't excuse us, tell us to give up. It's like it's an never-ending. We're being pushed to keep going and going and going. Anyway, so thanks for your comments. I think they're really great comments. I now want to talk about elements of this. It's one thing that we could dismiss Kant and say, okay, Kant's crazy. Has nothing to say to us about it, because he's saying basically that what really matters about morality is inaccessible to us. Well, where does that leave us when it comes to practical issues that we have to deal with every day? And so there's a temptation maybe here to just dismiss Kant and say, forget him. But there are elements of Kantian, this idea that these are our ideals that are inaccessible to us and are not accessible to us, no matter what kind of information we have about them. And we may not even be able to get information about them. They're that inaccessible to us. But that doesn't make them that useless or pointless. And this may have to do with our psychology, but here are some examples. And now I think we'll get into some, controversial aspects of it, because when you start to see where this leads, I think it'd be thought-provoking. It doesn't mean that I'm not necessarily defending Kant here. Even he was aware of what he was saying. It's a tall order, but I think it's too easy to dismiss him. Okay, here are some examples of kinds of behavior that human beings engage in that seem like Kant's theory to refer to things that are forever inaccessible to us, that are just beyond us. And yet we don't just say that's BS and forget it. Don't worry about that. We do worry about these things. We worry them even if we know they are beyond ever getting a simple, straightforward answer to them. So here, examples would be, and I'm going to just list them, and then I'll actually go into a little bit of depth with a couple of them. One is, here's 5 examples. Romantic love. Exactly what is going on with romantic love? What is it people want from it? I'll list them. Another area where these kinds of transcendent ideals appears: religious or spiritual belief or disbelief. Even atheists have this problem. Another one area is ethical principles that are talked a lot about these days. Things like justice, liberty, equality, human rights. All those they were concocted. Justice, liberty, equality, these things were made up by human beings. They're not like on the periodic table. They're not molecules that we find in nature. They were, you call them myths, truths, or insights, whatever you want to call them, but they were made up out of pure nothingness, ideas of people's heads. Epistemic ideals, this applies to science. Truth. What is truth? Is truth an example of a transcendent idea that we have no chance of ever getting at? You can do science without even appealing to truth, but some people think you need to occasionally use the term. And then finally, and probably biggest of all, is the meaning of life question. If you start asking questions about this, it's an age-old question, but unless you have some transcendent reason to think, to justify your reason for being here, you have a hard time convincing someone who doesn't think there is a meaning to their life, who wants to commit suicide, that they ought not to commit suicide, unless without appealing to these ideals that go beyond what you can observe around you. So all these areas, there tend to be all what they have in common is that they all make reference to things that are beyond any kind of transcendent ideals that just don't ever seem to be realized. So let me get into the an example. Let's go back to romantic love. There is where is it? I want to use two examples. One a very famous example. Another one, perhaps not as famous, though to literary people, they probably will know what it is. Think of the famous balcony scene in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is, she's asking for assurance from Romeo that he loves her. She does this in various ways, in different ways, and he goes around swearing by the moon and a bunch of other things, and she keeps, in the play, there's nothing to suggest prior to this, or for that matter, after this, to give her doubts that he loves her. I mean, he's not like he's done anything to inspire any doubt, but she keeps asking as though she's trying to get some information from him that is not obvious from having observed him, from what he says, from what he does. She keeps asking for something else. And she herself isn't always clear what she wants. And he makes these grand gestures like swearing by the moon. And she is right to be a little skeptical about that. What we're trying to get at here is she is, in a way, she's being extremely irrational. It's one thing to doubt somebody's love if you have evidence that they have been unfaithful to you or that they've plotted against you or something like that. That's perfectly rational. But in her case, she has none of that. So she's still wondering. She has a lot of emotional investment in this scene. And so that intense emotional investment in this thing causes her, because it's an important decision for her. It's not a minor. We can excuse rationalization. In fact, we can even ignore it in minor decisions. But all these areas which I was mentioning are serious. They're perceived by the actors involved in them as being serious, major decisions in their lives, whether or not to fall in love or accept a lover, as these young people really thought they were engaged. They weren't. They don't think they were. The play wouldn't be the play it is if they were joking with each other about this, or if they were insane. They are recognizable as beings who are striving for something that's a little bit beyond what they can clearly see with that's plain as day. Can you tell if someone loves you as plain as day, as easily as you can tell whether the sun is out or not? She keeps asking, and here's the thing, and she has reasons to ask. If she had reasons to ask him for some assurance of his love the first time, she would have reasons to continue asking him again and again and again forever. She would never get enough information, not even if they got married and lived happily ever after, and they're both on their deathbed and they never had any problems, not even after a lifetime of bliss with him, would that answer her question. Because all that is behavioral, all of that is observable, and what she was after was something beyond the observable. And then, so in a way, she's asking for something like what Kant was asking, something beyond what anyone could observe. And as with Kant, there's a sense in which even Romeo could not answer her question if he tried, because maybe Romeo doesn't have, wouldn't not have that transparency about his own deepest motivations here. He might be caught up in the same emotional state as she was, but being in an emotional state is not what they're talking about. That's like a clinical description of what they're involved in. They're obviously striving for something beyond describing a natural psychological state that both of them are in. That's not how they see it. We might see it as outsiders, and so those who are watching their story and are not actively in love with either one of them, we could be objective, we could be cool about it, but they can't. They're in the middle of it, and they want to believe something, and they're trying really hard to get at something. And part of the mystery of it is that they never do, or perhaps in no case does that happen. But what's interesting about this case is that in that case, the Romeo and Juliet case, there's no evidence here to justify her being doubtful about his affection for her. She's looking for some assurance, though, nevertheless. But compare that case with a different case, a more contemporary case from a famous short story written about in the 1970s, I believe. It's often taught because it is a small masterpiece on this subject. It's by Raymond Carver, and it's called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. What's interesting about this story, it involves a woman and her husband. They've been married for 5 years. Terry's her name. His name is Mel. They're sitting around the kitchen table drinking and having a talk with their neighbors, another couple who act like a Greek chorus. They're kind of listening to this couple talk and not saying much, but wondering. During the conversation, Terry brings up her previously horrifically dysfunctional and tragic relationship. And I'm going to quote from the story, just 3 paragraphs. Terry said the man she lived with before she lived with Mel loved her so much he tried to kill her. Then Terry said, he beat me up one night. He dragged me around the living room by my ankles. He kept saying, I love you, you bitch. He went on dragging me around the living room, my head knocking on things. Terry looked around the table. What do you do with love like that? And her husband, Mel, says, my God, don't be silly. That's not love. And you know it, Mel said. I don't know what you'd call it, but I sure know you wouldn't call it love. And then Terry says back, say what you want to, but I know it was, Terry said. It may sound crazy to you, but it's true, just the same. People are different, Mel. Sure, sometimes he may have acted crazy. Okay, but he loved me. In his own way, maybe, but he loved me. There was love there, Mel. Don't say there wasn't. In this case, there is plenty of observational evidence for a third party to say, obviously, he didn't love her. He was sick, he was ill, something's wrong with him, but he wasn't loved, right? Her husband, Mel, who was a healthcare professional, by the way, a cardiologist, who tries to be sensible about it and convince her that whatever was going on with her ex, he didn't love her, not treat her this way. She doesn't buy it. She's not convinced by him, though. She insists that despite the fact that she was abused by her former lover, this lover, who, by the way, is already dead, he may even have killed himself because of her, did in fact love her. Mr. Rational is her husband, Mel, cannot grasp this, how this could possibly be. Because to him, all the evidence seems to oppose any conclusion that her ex was anything but sick or psychopathic, and so on. Anyway, the conversation goes on, and there's more to the story, but the bottom line is that neither Mel, her husband, or Terry convince each other. They're both adamantly believe. One believes that she was loved by this person. The other says she's well, he doesn't say it, but he implies that she's being a little crazy to think he did love her. So what is going on here? What is it that Terry saw that nobody else can see that makes her say that despite the counter evidence that her ex really did love her? Now, there's no simple answer to this. It's just that whatever it is that love is, must not be observable. Whatever its traits aren't ones you can see with your eyes, or at least sometimes some people will talk this way. The story is called What People Talk About when they talk about love. It's not saying what love is. This is a fictional story. It's not a philosophical explanation or conclusion, or it's not arguing. The author is very careful to report on the story without taking sides. He's obviously sympathetic to both of them. They both make sense to him, but that's how he ends the story. There's no resolution here. So that's one example of where things like transcendent ideas that cannot be cashed out in observable behavior or plain old everyday sensible motivations like habit, like fear of consequences or self-interest or selfishness. All those categories just seem to fail to describe certain kinds of human obsessions. That's just one of them. Another one has to do with well, maybe I'll pause here and before I go. This one has to do with a case of non-suicide. Usually, when suicide is discussed by philosophers, it's usually about is it suicide ever justifiable? But a more interesting case is a case of a non-suicide. What is a non-suicide? This is what the rest of us are doing. People who do not commit. What is the reason why more people don't commit suicide? Well, it turns out, and this is interesting, the reasons are summed up by those very 4 reasons that Kant talked about: habit, fear, self-interest, and empathy. Why most people, even if they are miserable, they're used to their lives. They have something. They're not the happiest people in the world, but they've made it this far and they're going to hang in there till the end, probably out of habit. Or they're afraid. They're afraid of what comes after, or afraid of the process of dying, fear of consequences. Or they're just plain self-interested. They don't want to do anything that does experience the pain of hurting yourself. Perhaps they even like their lives a little bit. That's selfishness, though. Or empathy. They may not kill themselves because they're afraid of the harm it will do the people around them, people who care about them. Or they might, this is a real thing. People sometimes don't kill themselves because they are afraid that by killing themselves, they weaken the resolve of the people who they do care for them to survive. They don't want to add a bit of negativity to the world that could harm someone else. So it's actually empathy. The sympathy for other people is keeping you alive, is the idea. These are the very same 4 things that Kant was talking about that justify most human behavior. And it justifies non-suicide as well, most of them. Now, could there be a transcendent reason for, by the way, Kant also fiercely was anti-suicide. He said, for the same reason he thought murder was wrong, suicide was wrong, because suicide is self-murder. A rationally autonomous being is such a special being that if you destroyed them, that's the reason why murder is wrong. And if you're one, killing yourself is the same thing as murder. So he was adamantly opposed to any rationalization for suicide or murder because they were the same thing. But there are lots of philosophers who would defend at least some kinds of suicide, such as end-of-life situations where one's pain and suffering is simply not rationally justifiable. And some people would say that is as good a reason as they need to end it. But Kant would say, not even if your life is a living hell, do you have a reason to kill yourself. He's absolutely adamant about that. Again, for the same reason you would be against suicide. It's like you're a rational autonomous being. You don't go around destroying such beings, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. Anyway, so let me sort of sum this up, and then we can open it up or whatever people want to do now. These 4 things that Kant talked about, habit, which is kind of like inertia or momentum. We're in the middle of something, our lives. We're here. No one asked our permission to before they gave birth to us. We're here. But now that we're here, we are caught up in all this, and we bought our ticket, we're on the train ride, we want to finish it, most of us. Whether it's good or bad, most of us are not going to kill ourselves. And some of us might be afraid of killing ourselves, and some of us do actually like certain aspects of our lives and wouldn't want to kill ourselves. And finally, some of us, even if we don't have any special self-interest in wanting to preserve ourselves, may be concerned to stick around for the benefit of other people. If you combine all these motives have nothing to do with rational autonomy. In fact, they all apply to animals too. Kant's understanding of humanity was that what makes human beings special is their rational autonomy. To the extent we are animals, he admitted, but we're animals plus something else that is over and above being an animal. All these things we just mentioned are all things that apply to an animal as well. There's nothing special about them. And to the extent we're being motivated by those things, we're being just like any other animal. And there's nothing special about that. That's why there's nothing morally worthy about those things. Not that they're bad, just that they don't confer any great moral worth on you. To continue to live for that reason that he gave, that our rational autonomy is what makes us special. We're among the rare instances of rational autonomy in the universe, and for us to take our own lives or take any other life is the worst thing that we could possibly, the most immoral thing imaginable from this point of view. And these other reasons are just, we share them with all the other animals on the planet. There's nothing special about that. You don't need morality to explain that. Evolution does a fine job of it, is what he would say. So there's a lot of more little details in the write-up we can talk about, but I'm going to pause here and see what people want to say, if anything. But the purpose of this last part was just to show that what Kant, the ideals that Kant was trying to put into morality. As far as I know, he's one of the most rigorous people to try to do this. Apply way beyond just ethics. They apply to many other important decisions that people make. We're not normally concerned about motives or whether people are rationalizing or not in the vast majority of decisions we make. Who cares whether what people's motives are for why you had coffee instead of tea this morning? It's not a whole lot rides on your motive with that kind of decision. But about these very significant life decisions involving love, suicide, death, about those things, we do get riled up about things that go beyond just the animal, the natural world, and all the forces that act on us. So if we're going to dump Kant, it's because Kant is being a little bit off the deep end with his super high standards. We may have to start thinking differently about these other things as well, because they also seem to be pointing in directions that go beyond what animals do. If we think of ourselves primarily as just highly sophisticated animals, then we don't need Kant. But Kant thought we were beyond that, or at least verging on being beyond that, or could imagine ourselves being beyond that. Anyway, so anybody have any thoughts about this? Does it still seem crazy?
I've got some thoughts. I don't know if
Sure.
in that Raymond Carver story,
Yeah.
The former husband, I mean, in this dramatic fiction, it would have been true, I think, that he probably had multiple conflicting emotions, like he probably was in love, and maybe he was jealous too. So, I mean, it sounds like there's kind of an overriding, a little bit of a fallacy involved in that, in terms of trying to reduce the situation to a single motivation, like the the abusive husband, he had more than one emotion. And you could say those are animal emotions too, I guess. This is a good example too, I think, Victor. But I think that what emerges in that short story is what Nietzsche wouldn't like, a Platonic ideal. Like there's this up, way up in the heavens, there's love invented that is inaccessible. We can't actually see it. It's up there somewhere. That kind of, Nietzsche didn't like that kind of stuff. But I mean, I think that was what was overriding in the story, was that they were kind of assuming that, there was the existence of this love, which would kind of cancel out these, lower emotions. Philosopher like Kant is not going to like stuff like, rage and jealousy and, despite their intrinsic parts of people's lives. He didn't like that kind of stuff. And, but, so it seems, partly this seems like the age-old empiricist versus rationalist debate. One empiricist like a Hume versus a Plato kind of thing.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think the puzzling part in the story wasn't so much what's going on with her ex, but with her. She was dead. She described all this evidence, what she described, and the story actually goes beyond this. He did more outrageous things than what I read there. And he ended up killing himself by, in a horrible way. I think he drank rat poison, and then when that didn't do it, he fired a bullet into his head. And that cardiologist, who she's now married to, happened to be at the hospital when her ex was there, and so they met each other. And he threatened.
I remember this. I read this once.
Oh, you read the story? Yeah.
I'm surprised he has a cardiologist as one of his main characters, because usually they're like a guy that works at the bowling alley, or maybe a barber or something. It's usually not somebody that's way up on the social ladder.
Yeah. But I think the puzzle was like, okay, what was going? She is the one who insisted that he loved her. He's dead. He's history. But she apparently, despite that behavior she described, something about him made her think, and she didn't waver a bit, that he somehow, as she says, in his own way, loved her. And is that something going on, including just in her head? Or, I mean, obviously, empirically, looking at it as an outsider, most people would shake their head and say, the guy was sick, and that would be the end of the story. But she insisted on that being love. And by the way, her new husband, Mel, the cardiologist, goes on and tries to argue with her a bit. And toward the end, he tells his own story, if you remember that, about his experience with an older couple that were nearly killed in a really serious car accident. He was in the hospital at the time, and some kind of, he had a more spiritualistic understanding of what love was like. In fact, the story begins with him saying that he wasn't in the seminary, an ex-priest, before he became cardiologist. So he had his semi-religious understanding of things. But anyway, but throughout the story, this mostly takes place at the kitchen table, they're drinking, and he gets drunker and drunker, as you can tell. And toward the end, he is like, he almost has to drink himself into accepting the story of Terry, his wife. It's like his own story is kind of outrageous too, but it's outrageous in the completely opposite way, about this older couple who were so deeply in love that they were about to die, both of them, and the only thing that one guy could think of was that he was wrapped head to toe in bandages, and they covered his eyes even, and he complained to the doctor that he wanted to see his wife. Okay, they were both that he took to be a sign of real love. Okay. But the thing is, before he got to that story, he was roaring drunk. I mean, I guess the story is, about what people talk about. What they talk about. There's no. I also get the feeling that Carver was not being really. He's not trying to be judgmental about these people. He's just noticing, this is how people talk sometimes, and and there's not a question who's right or who's wrong, but that it is sometimes human beings somehow want to see things in the empirical world which aren't there to an observer. I mean, it's not obvious why Terry thinks her ex loved her, given all that she describes. And but yeah, it's an interesting story. So you read it, Mike? You read the story?
Oh, yeah, I used to read Raymond Carver. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, you're right. He was actually I thought it was pretty good. It's been a long time since I read it, but my impression was that he often dealt with very serious issues with everyday, plain, ordinary people. Very simple, stories, like people talking over a fence about at the middle of the night over gardening, for example, but there would be some serious point being made there. Anyway, so anybody else have anything to say so far?
Yeah, I think I mean, people can call different things the way they want it, but they might not really mean it. Let's use the example of love, right? They might just call this relationship love because they want to, I don't know, save face, or they want to maintain a certain social identity. The motivation is unclear in this situation, and we can examine that by asking them how maybe we can ask them about maybe they might have examples that they consider as love, excluding the particular relationship they're talking about. And among all the examples they can come up with, we can try to come up with principles or guidelines where they actually judge what love is, and maybe comparing these principles, we can use that to evaluate whether that particular relationship actually fits their definition of love. If you understand what I'm saying. So I don't think when people call something love or justice or moral, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the thing that they actually follow the principle, that they actually makes the judgment to any other things they encounter, if you know what I mean. So I'm not so sure that's like the right example to use to make the argument, so to speak, because I don't know, I might be thinking too much about the context that we don't know. I have a feeling that if you were to ask the person in the story, they would probably come up, if you ask them to examine what they really mean by love, or they might not actually categorize their own relationship in those principles, if you know what I'm saying. If I make myself clear this point. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that example in the story there is a good example of the difference between what we're called legality and morality. Legality is observable. It can be categorized. People can sit around and say, this kind of behavior is love and this kind of behavior is not. Why? Like this kind of behavior is speeding and this kind of behavior is not speeding if you're driving on the highway. It's observable, empirical. The problem in the story is that empirically, if by any normal standard of what love is, someone who drags you around by the ankles, knocking your heads on furniture is not exactly your first thought that comes up when you say that guy must love her, right? So it's, if anything, it sounds like something opposite to that, and yet that's what she insists that, and there's more disturbing behavior she describes in the story, that it nevertheless was love. She doesn't budge from that from the beginning to the end, despite the fact she acknowledges what she's being told. And obviously it doesn't make sense from Mr. Rational or Mel, her husband's, or current husband's perspective, or for that matter, I'm sure a couples therapist or some external behavior therapist would agree that's not love. They would say she needs to get over this if she believes that was love. I'm sure that's the kind of advice she would get. Because the advice you get would be advice to look at this like a rational person. And rationally, that can't be an instance of love. But then it asks the questions. It raises the question: is love rational? Is it even nothing? Does it have anything to do with rationality? Is morality rational? Does it have anything to do? I strangely enough, Kant thought it would have everything in the world to do with rationality, but with the fact that there was rationality in the universe, but not that in the way it gets manifested in the real world, there's a world that we have to live in, it's a rational world. People disagree with that. No, the world we live in is a world in which reason barely makes an appearance, but don't expect nature to be rational. It is what it is. Because rationality, in his view, has a normative component. It's about how things ought to be, and the way that logic or reasoning, there's correct reasoning and fallacious reasoning. There's an oughtness to that, just like there's a morality. There's an oughtness to the wrongness, to something being right, being good. So it's a normative activity. Rationality, logic, and ethics are both normative activities. They're trying to lay down the rules about how things ought to be. But the natural world, the world in which instincts and natural tendencies and physics and the laws of nature operate, in that world, there's no, if we see rationality there, it's an imposition coming from us. Unless you do believe that somehow, and there are some philosophers who do, that maybe Hegel believed this, that there was, that the world as it is rational. We sometimes glimpse it, the reason. But I guess I'm more inclined to think that the world simply is. It's not one way or another. And we use reason as a tool to help cope with it, to organize it, to deal with it, to have it make sense for us. But it's not that the reason is there in nature. It's that it's a tool we use to tame or domesticate nature. But nature just is what it is. Neither good, bad, right or wrong, rational or irrational. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm not against that. It's just that, yeah, the world as it is whether you find a pattern, right?
Yeah.
That applies to moral intuitions or the sense of love, or even physics. It's just something that we are clear about, and we see a pattern, and then we call this rational. Basically, if we cannot see a pattern, then it's chaos, is irrational. We call something else.
Right.
Yeah, it is something that's just as human, to make sense out of the world and make it useful.
Yeah.
But even in the case that we examine Mr. Rational and that relationship, I doubt that if they were to apply the principle that govern their judgment, they would still to consider that that love. They might call it that way, but they would against all the other examples that they would consider love. If you understand what yeah. So yeah, that's my point. I mean, they're just calling it that, but they might not necessarily really consider that as love, in the sense that how in the same way that they judge every other cases that they consider as love. If you know what I said, know what I mean. I'm just arguing that it seems like they're just calling it that love, but not really meaning. They're not using the word consistently. Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
Yeah. When you say they're just calling that love, you mean like the character Terry is calling how she was treated love? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
You say they, you mean people like her? Or...
Yeah, people like her. Yeah, in the story. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
But that's just my conjecture, because I don't know, because they might actually
Well, that's an interesting point, because if you don't trust the judgment of someone who says and isn't joking that they believe that they were loved,
yeah,
what standard were you going to use? I mean, are you going to say for them, oh, they loved you whether you believe it or not, they don't, or they
No,
don't.
the standard is simple. The simple is to have them examine any other example that they consider as love,
Yeah.
and whether that principle actually apply to the case that they are into, right? Because that's what they really mean by love. That's how they judge what love is, right? Among all the example. But if that's the case, in that particular relationship, if that fails to meet the principle, that fits their judgment in every other cases, then they don't mean what they said, if you know what I mean.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So you're saying, like, if Terry had heard of another case of an abusive relationship and a case like hers, and then inconsistently denied that that was love, then she'd be revealing that she's inconsistent or irrational. I mean, she judges her own case differently from that of other cases.
Yeah, I guess that's in essence that's what I meant. Because I have
Yeah.
a feeling that in this case they just want to call this love, but that's maybe inconsistent with how they judge any other cases else. Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah,
they don't
that's-
use the word consistently. That's how I say
Right.
it.
Well, I would say that I agree. I think that makes, if someone like Terry, and assuming she's sincere about what she's saying, and I have no reason to doubt in the story that she was.
Yeah.
Um, if she were to then encounter another relationship that didn't involve her, but some other situation that was like that, and she didn't agree that that could be love, then I would say, yeah, she's being, it takes away from her credibility in her own case. But if she is consistent, if she says, look, I've seen this happen before, and I would still call it love, then that enhances her credibility, that she's consistent about it. You may not agree with what she calls love, that it's love, but at least you know she's consistent about it.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then again, there's no way I can examine that, because that's in the story
Right.
too, right? Because she might be consistent, but I have a feeling that most cases people just call
Yeah.
things
Right.
but not really.
And of course, there are people who would simply dismiss her as just not as there's a word for it, a phrase of people who, I forget what it is, people who
Yeah.
stay in abusive relationships because they become dependent upon this abuse, and it does something for their sense of identity or security, or they feel that even an abusive love is better than no love at all, or something like that. Or
Yeah.
but those judgments are coming from outside the person. They're coming from kind of social regulation. The society doesn't want to promote that kind of relationship. So if you hear about it, they're going to say that's wrong. The parties need therapy, or something needs to be done. There's a problem here to fix. But that's coming from a motivation that's a social one, largely, not about this person's how they feel. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, I guess we've gone 2 hours. So first of all, I want to thank everybody who's still here, especially Bill and Ralph and Mike for bringing up some pretty good questions. And let's see, what are we going to do next time? I forget what I have in place for next time. Oh yeah, we're going to be talking about the relationship between what philosophers say and their personal lives. Is there supposed to be a connection between the two? You would think there would be, but yeah, that's what it's going to be about. And I'm going to see what there's. I believe that discussion is also going to involve. It's not in the write-up that's visible right now, but it'll be part of the extended write-up. It's going to use. I'm going to use this as an example, a very recent debate about the free will determinism, age-old debate. There's a new recall about it, and that relates to that topic about the extent to which how seriously should you take what philosophers say. I mean, do they mean it literally when they say, for example, someone who says there is no free will at all, and there are lots of philosophers who are saying that it's just everything's determined. As far, that's what science is telling us. They said we have to bite the bullet and say nobody has free will. Okay, well, what does that mean if you took that seriously? How would it change your life and how decisions you make? anyway, those are the kinds of questions it's going to be addressing next time. So again, thanks everybody who's here. Okay.
Hey,
Thank you,
Victor,
Victor. Thank you for organizing this.
Yeah.
comment.
Yeah.
I think that in Raymond, it might be in that book, but Raymond Carver, the story ends with something like, if your wife tells you she loves you, just believe her because there's a chance she might mean it.
I don't remember that one. Yeah, but we'll see. Yeah.
That's wise.
You guys later.
Well, okay, bye.